Sure this is working. Awesome. Okay, good.
What does Behar mean?
Behar, so har in Hebrew means mountain.
It's a
the name of the
Sephardic last. It's a Sephardic last name, so I was just wondering.
Yeah, no, it means like the mountain or on the mountain. It's referring to Mount Sinai in this case.
Mm-hmm.
I have a cousin in Israel who just married a fellow from Iraq, and his last name is Zohar.
Ohar or Behar?
Zohar.
Oh, Zohar. Oh.
Zohar, like the book. You know,
Yeah. Very cool.
I don't know if that has any relation to just har.
No, it's a different, it's a different root, but it sounds very similar. Absolutely.
This
All
is
right,
an intercultural marriage. An Ashkenazi married to a Mizrahi, I guess you call them.
Very cool. Hope they have a lifetime of happiness. That's awesome.
Indeed.
So why don't we begin with our blessing over the Torah so that we can immerse ourselves in Torah. And indeed, this week's Torah portion, what we're going to be focused on, we're not going to get very far in the Torah portion. In fact, all we're going to study today is the very first line of our double portion. I stopped at line 1, but I think there is plenty to discuss just on that one line alone. But first, let's offer our blessing. Yalla lai 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 lai. Yalla lai 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 lai. Yalla lai 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 lai. Yalla lai 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 lai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך לעסוק בדברי תורה. All right, so let us dive into this Torah portion. And did everyone get my link to the sheet yesterday?
To what?
So I can't see any of you.
Your link to the what?
The sheet, the text sheet. So the sheet that I show on the screen, I also email out as a link so that you can get it on your own, because sometimes it's hard to see all the text on the screen and people prefer to print it out. So if you're not getting it, Jerry, let me know and I'll make sure that I double check my list.
Okay, please do, because I didn't see it.
I also don't get it either.
Oh, I will change that, Ezra. And I will change that, Jerry. I'll go back into it right after Torah to make sure that you do get it. That's why I'm asking. I certainly don't want to exclude a single person. Okay, so let me share my screen. Here we go. So this Torah portion is called Behar Bechukotai. Behar, as we said, means like on the mountain. And Bechukotai means like my laws, essentially. It comes from the same root as huk, which is law, and the I ending means mine. I forgot I had the blessing for Torah at the top of the screen. Okay, so we'll get past that for right now. But at the beginning of Bechukotai, actually, we're not focused on Behar. We're focused on it's a double portion. So it's 2 different Torah portions pushed together. We're focused on the second of the 2. And with these, the book of Leviticus will come to a close. So this is the very last section in the book of Leviticus. Next week, we'll start the book of Numbers. And if I forget for us to say chazak at the end, please let me know, but we're not there yet. First, we got to study this one. So who wants to just read this one line that we're focused on today?
Oh, I will.
Who said that? Go ahead.
Go.
Me?
Jerry.
Yeah, please.
Oh,
Oh, you.
you said Steve.
No.
Did you say Jerry or Steve?
No, Jerry, go ahead.
Oh, why does the verse list laws and commandments? What is?
Oh, before that.
Before
Yeah.
that.
Oh, if you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments.
Okay, so our entire Torah portion today is just on these words.
Oh, my
It might
Lord.
seem like there's very little there, right? Because it's not even a full sentence. There's a whole piece that comes after it. That would take us in an entirely different direction. Are you having trouble hearing?
No.
We
Okay.
can't hear Jerry.
Oh, you couldn't hear me?
Hardly. Very, very poor quality.
Can you now?
Yes.
That's much better.
If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So that's our focus. What I want to do is start with what the rabbis call the pshat, or the simple kind of reading of the text, which begins with this simple question that you were also reading, Miriam, a second ago, of why does the verse list laws and commandments? So we see here, it says, if you follow my laws, Bechukotai, my laws, and faithfully observe my commandments, which is et mitzvotai, mitzvot, commandments, we know that. So the question is, why are those two things listed separately? Anyone have any ideas? There's no wrong answers here.
Well, it probably has something to do with the concept that there's different levels of the laws and commandments, and that some of them are logical, others are dubious, and others are downright not understandable. Why do we have to have a red heifer and all those type of laws? So might have to do with that concept.
Okay, so maybe there actually is a differentiation truly in what they do and how we might follow them.
Not to take away from that, but I thought there was a poetic style in Hebrew where one statement is repeated in a different way. And if that were the case, then it would seem like one is
True, yeah.
the same as the other. It's just a different set of words. And not to take away from the earlier concept, but I thought there was something to do with poetic style and repetition.
Yeah, sometimes there is that kind of poetic style. That's
But
exactly
there are no
right.
wasted words. There's never any waste. Every word has significance. That's another basic concept of the way it's written. So
Right.
if they use the word laws and the commandments, they meant that to be two separate concepts.
Maybe it has to do with the power of the governing body.
Okay, so we have a lot of different ideas here. Yeah, maybe it has to do with who exactly is governing these things. That's a great idea. To get back to this little conversation between you, Steve and Jim, I just want to say, yes, there are times where there is that poetic kind of license that takes place. That doesn't mean that words are wasted, by the way. Because what happens is when there is that parallelism that occurs, one word is teaching us something about the other word, and it's therefore giving us further insight into the Torah, because if we use our concordance and we look up the many places where a certain word is used, we learn more about what the full meaning of that word is. And so sometimes it can expand our understanding through that deep dive text study. But in this case, because in the Torah, it sometimes uses huk or chok, right? This idea of laws very specifically in some areas, and it uses mitzvot in other areas. The rabbis are trying to pull it apart and say, no, we think that these are two separate things here. What is this really all about? So you're both right. It's just, there's different things that are going on. Yeah.
Well, isn't there like a commandment is something that we're told by God we have to do, and a law is something we're supposed to do.
Right. A
So
law
you're
is
saying that-
something that you're told this is what you must do. A commandment is kind of gives you some wiggle room, that it would be nice if you observed my commandment.
Okay, so maybe there's a differentiation about how mandatory it truly is.
I was trying to put myself back in time to when perhaps I was hearing this for the first time. And I think I would have needed to hear this for clarity, because I would have been used to having or to being around people and others who had a lot of gods. And if I had just learned that there is but one God, I think I'd need that reinforced by this. Well, it's not even a sentence, as you said, it's a phrase. If you follow my laws, I think that's God. And I need to pay attention to that. And those commandments, I think, am I referencing the 10 commandments at this time? Have I gotten those? So then if that's true, and I'm here listening or learning this, or however it was, provided to me, I think it provides a lot of clarity for a person back then.
Yeah, and this was likely, it was referring to the 10 commandments. We received that, but it's probably referring to the 613 commandments throughout the Torah. So it's even more expansive, but that only underlines your point, Marla.
Yeah.
Were not the laws man-made?
Well, according to the Torah, they weren't. And you're getting a little ahead of us. Sorry. So we're going to go there. I'm glad you asked that question, right?
Yes.
But within the Torah, we have to think about the context of why the Torah was written. And so within the context of the Torah, all of the commandments are given by God. There may be some of us in this Torah study today who believe that the commandments came directly from God. There may be some of us here today who believe that they were divinely inspired, and we might interpret that in any number of ways. And there are some of us here today who might believe that they are man-made, right? This is not a place where we judge anyone for any of those beliefs. But according to the Torah, it's very clear that all of these things come directly from God.
I was talking about the laws, not the commandments.
Even the laws.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because this is still within the context of the Torah. So there is a differentiation between Deoraita and Derabanan. Deoraita means laws that come from the Torah itself, and then Derabanan, laws that come from the rabbis. But since this is still in the Torah, everything is Deoraita. Everything is from the Torah itself. So what I want us to do is kind of dive into a couple of these texts that are just a few different speculations as to why the mitzvot and the chukim are mentioned separately in this verse. Then we're going to get more into the deeper kind of ideas that some of you were already hinting at a few minutes ago. So the first one I'm going to bring in is something from Sifra on this Torah portion. If in my statutes you walk. So just looking at the, yeah, actually I'm going to leave that out. The idea of walking relates to halacha. I'll talk about that in a little bit. If in my statutes you walk, I would think that these are the mitzvot. So statutes is what they're using for chukim. Okay, so it's saying if you follow my chukim, my laws, if you follow God's laws, I would think that these are referring to the mitzvot. But in my mitzvot, and you keep to do them, mitzvot are already stated. How then am I to understand if in my statutes you walk? And the answer it gives, that you toil in Torah. It is written in Leviticus 26:14. And if you do not hearken to me, I might think that these words are spoken of the mitzvot. But in Leviticus, it also says, and do all of these mitzvot. Mitzvot are already stated. How do I understand if you hearken to me? Also, again, it says to toil. So actually, I want to read the next one too, because the two of them in tandem, I think, will make this a little bit clearer, and then we can talk through it. So Or HaChaim, a commentator, said, if you walk in my statutes. And Torah, sorry? Okay. In Torah Kohanim, they explain as follows. If the Torah has spoken only about Bechukotai, my laws, I would have assumed that what was meant were the mitzvot. Now that the Torah added the words ve'etz mitzvotai and also the mitzvot, the word bechukotai cannot actually apply to the mitzvot, seeing the Torah already wrote about them. The additional word bechukotai therefore teaches us that one has to toil in order to get Torah knowledge. The reason the Torah refers to toiling over Torah by using the expression chakah is because there is a commandment to study matters again and again, even if one has already studied them several times and they have been well absorbed. God wants us to study Torah out of fondness for it, and this is why he formulated a statute to this effect. We follow that our sages in Kohelet Rabbah state that God decreed that we will forget part of what we learned in order that we should sit down and learn it repeatedly.
Where the blessing we say, the words are very clear that we should turn it over and over and over, even though we've read the same thing every year for the last 2,000 years, 3,000 years.
Right. I mean, the blessing that we say before, the blessing that we say before we study Torah, every time we come together, right, is this blessing where it talks about emerging ourselves, hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage. But the word lasok actually means more than engage. It means to completely immerse ourselves. But you're right, there is this idea also, like on Simchat Torah, where we finish reading the Torah and then we start it again, of like turn it and turn it over and over again. Keep studying it every single time. Even on Passover, if you know everything from the Haggadah backwards and forwards, if you are the most well-learned Torah scholar there is, you still have to retell the story. I'm very, very clear about that.
If I could just draw an analogy, I don't mean to be facetious or anything, but I'm reminded in the way that the Torah is studied throughout the year and then the next year studied again. Years ago, when I visited San Francisco, I marveled at the Golden Gate Bridge, and somebody told me that the people who painted never stopped. They start at one end and go all the way through, and by the time they hit the other end, it's time to start at the beginning again. And why is that? Well, because the paint may have rusted, your memory may have faded. Maybe there's a better paint or something. I don't really know, but it just seems that the repetition is there for a reason.
Yeah. Oh,
That's
yeah.
a really interesting analogy. I didn't know about that. That's great. Yeah, we have to constantly keep wrestling with it. It's not something that you just do and you're done. And perhaps that's a really powerful reminder at the beginning of this portion, right? Adding to that, Seforno, another commentator, medieval commentator, says that the chukot, these laws, are like royal decrees. Something a person has to be guided by if he expects his endeavor in life to prosper. They cannot just be performed by rote, but must be performed consciously. So in some ways, it's a little different from the first idea, right? We toil with it. And in addition to toiling with it, they're related, but they're a little bit different. We have to really be very thoughtful about that when we're doing something with thoughtfulness, being really conscious of why it is that we're doing what we're doing.
This is something that I was taught when I was young, as when it comes to the service. We know all the prayers by heart by the time you're a teenager. But my rabbi always told me, you don't say it by heart. You read it. And when we go to Chabad, and he does it, and Rabbi Hecht leads us in the Kaddish, he reads it every single time. He does not start it until he picks up the book and starts reading the Kaddish. This man has said that prayer literally millions of times in his lifetime, but he always looks at the book as he's saying it.
Yes, I totally agree. There's so many times that people say, no, I know it. I don't need a book. Like, no, there actually is a merit to reading it from the page, to not just saying the words, because it can enable us to really have that thoughtfulness when we're saying the words of prayer. And what you're talking about, Steve, is a differentiation, I think, also between keva and kavana. So these words might be a little foreign to you.
I just jump in here with the word?
Sorry, it's really hard to
Can you-
hear you. I'm so sorry, Herb.
It's cutting out.
Yeah, we can't make out any of the words that you're saying. I'm so sorry.
Rabbi, I wanted to say something. I had to leave for a second. There was someone at the door. In one of the first paragraphs that we read, there was toiling and doing. And the word doing stuck in my mind because, you know, it's one thing to study the Torah and to do it each and every year. But as we all know and try, is to incorporate what we've learned from the Torah into our daily lives to do what the Torah teaches, rather than just necessarily only to study it. So, I mean, I'm sure others have said variations of what I've said, but I just wanted to express that.
Right. So that could be part of the toiling,
Yeah,
right? Is how do
yeah.
we take these words and these laws and really apply them to our lives?
Isn't that important? I mean, isn't that, to me, that's very important. Exactly.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Irv, I'm really hoping that you'll be able to connect somehow so that we can hear what you have to say. I'm sorry. I'm sure that's really frustrating to have something to say and to not be able to get that across.
Maybe he could write it in chat.
Yeah, he's on his phone, so I don't know if that's
Oh.
going to be easy to do, but I'm just hoping that there might be a better way
That's
to
right.
connect.
He's out of town right now.
Yeah, hopefully. But I just wanted to say one quick thing, because I don't know if people are aware of the differentiation between keva and kavanah. That keva is doing what the tradition is, right? These are the prayers, so I'm going to say these prayers. These are the laws, so I'm going to do these laws. And kavanah is having intentionality when we do it, really focusing on the meaning here. And I think that's some of what Saforno is getting to in his commentary.
I teach my students all the time that when we're doing prayers, it's important for the kavanah to be there and not just to do something just because we're told to do it. Because if we just say something and go through the action, you know, just go through it, but we really don't care, it's not giving the proper respect to the idea of the prayer, and we're not getting out of it what we're hoping for. And that's why it's very important to me that I always teach the kids that the most important thing is to show honor and dignity to the prayer and to be able to understand. That's why we go over a little bit what the prayer means and why it's important. And
yeah, I'm sure you're an incredible teacher, Jay. That sounds so important.
You know, Rabbi Cassi, this was a really validating a small piece here. I don't want to belabor it, but I remember thinking to myself, and I've never shared it, but I have noticed always that the three rabbis I've known, you know, Rabbi Lee, Rabbi Chuck, and yourself, always read from the Bima these prayers. And I remember asking myself, why do they do that? They have indeed said these prayers aloud a gazillion times. And I remember never asking about that, but thinking about it. And so today I learned from you that there is a reason behind that. And it does make the experience even more gratifying to me.
I think it's also more welcoming in some ways too, because someone who doesn't feel like they have a fluency with the prayer, they're reading from the prayer just like everyone else. And there's something that's communal, and that's really uplifting about that as well. I mean, that's not the primary reason, but I think it's a really wonderful kind of side effect. So I want to bring us into the second piece of this. Is we know in our verse that we're looking at, it says, if you follow my laws and mitzvot, but it doesn't actually give the ending to that. The Torah does, but the question is, what is the thing that makes sense for us? What's the ending to that? And so I'm going to bring in just a few different teachings around that. The first thing here is a quote from Psalms, and the reason I'm bringing that in is because it's referenced in the commentary below that says, "I have considered my ways and I have turned back to your decrees." So there's this text from Or HaChaim. I brought in a lot of Or HaChaim today because he has some really awesome commentary on this particular verse. He's talking about King David. So David had considered daily to do his own thing, but had found that invariably his feet brought him to the Torah Academy or the house of prayer. The lesson is that when one applies himself to Torah and its precepts diligently, one's very organs will automatically help one to head in the spiritually correct direction. You may translate the line, "If according to my statutes, you will find yourself walking in the right direction." So it's going back to this first verse where it says that what it's really saying is if you're following all of these things, you'll find yourself going in the right direction.
There are only a few of the laws that we are told to do to give us specific reward. In the Ten Commandments, if you honor your father and your mother, your days will be long in the land. That's the only one of the 10 that has a specific reward. And in the Shema, we have in the second verse of the Shema, where it says, "If you do all of my commandments, I'll bring you rain in the season at the appropriate time." And
right, and that, Steve, is
those
actually
exceptions.
Right, but Steve, that actually is what follows our Torah verse today. I didn't bring that in.
Sorry.
Because that will take us in. No, don't say sorry. That's exactly right. I'm glad that you're bringing that piece in. It says that, like, if you follow all of these things, good things will happen for you. And if you don't, not so good. You're not going to have the rain that you need, and so on. That brings us down a totally different rabbit hole than I wanted to go down. I went down a completely separate rabbit hole today. But yes, you're right. Sometimes it does give those rewards, and sometimes perhaps the rewards are not so tangible. There's this one verse that also comes from the Talmud that says, "Greater is the one who is commanded and does it than one who is not commanded and still does it." Curious what you make of that.
Well, to me, it's saying that following the instructions and the directions of what you're commanded to do is more important than doing something even though you're not commanded to do it.
So what's the extra element there that makes it so much more important?
That's a toughie.
I think that the second part of that phrase is really make somebody greater.
No, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
That might be the superficial answer, but it seems that if you're doing something, it may indicate that you're doing it because you feel like it, and you're not being told to. It makes you maybe self-congratulatory.
So you're right. It seems a little bit counter to what we normally think, right? Mm-hmm. If someone asks us to help, but it's perhaps not as good as if we see the need and we act on it before someone even asks. But this is speaking to something a little bit different. It's saying the fact that God gave us these commandments and we choose to do it and to really do them passionately is better than if we just decided to do something on our own. Like for me, the difference between the two is this coherence to community. That God is asking us as a community to do something. And if we collectively respond and do it, then we're not only acting because it's the right thing to do individually, but we're acting because it's the right thing to do communally.
And also, if I may, it's also saying that you're acting along with God in doing it.
Yeah, thank you.
It has to do with obeying also, does it not?
And the rabbis are very concerned with that, right? So it makes sense that they're saying that at this time. Like they're trying to get the Jews to all come together. They've been exiled. This is a time of exile and trying to exert rabbinic authority. And so they're trying to say, yeah, follow the rules. It's so important that you do that. The context is very important, clearly. Okay, I'm going to go through this one last text so that I can get to the meat of this. And seeing the time, we'll see how far we get. I knew there was no way we would get through all this text, but I wanted you to have the text to go through on your own. Because when I printed it out, I saw that it ended up being a 7-page long text. And there's no way we can get through that much in an hour. So one other piece here, David used to rise from his bed at midnight, singing the praises of God until God himself, his holy name, arose on his throne at dawn, in reference to the emanation of Malchut. Malchut is the same thing as the Shekhinah. It's like an aspect of God that is like equated to the Sabbath bride. That's most earthly, as earthly as God can get. We learned in Leviticus 24 that the reverse is possible also. When the Torah says the son of the Israelite woman made a hole in the name of God by cursing it. So there was an incident where, in last week's Torah portion that we didn't get into, where there was someone who said God's name in vain, who cursed God. And there was a terrible punishment that ensued in response. This source is the reason that we can interpret the verse in Samuel as we did. This is also why the Torah writes in Leviticus 26, Basitam Otam, meaning that if you perform the commandments, the result will be that you improve God's name. So in acting the way that he did in last week's Torah portion, this man blasphemed God's name, but by performing the commandments, as we have in this Torah portion, Shnei Luchot Habrit is saying, you will actually improve God's name in doing so. This is a Musar text. That's where this comes from, it's out of Musar study. So any thoughts on that? It's definitely very like cerebral, be sure. I just thought it was really powerful to say that by doing something, we not only help ourselves and help community, but we in some way improve God. That's a really powerful and fascinating statement. But the crux of where I want to go today is really around this idea of laws. And we've touched upon it here and there so far. But as Reform Jews, or as members of a Reform Jewish community, the question really is, what do we make of these laws and these commandments? What do they mean to us? And so I have a few different texts that speak to that. The first, I brought in a little more Or HaChaim because, like I said, he has such great commentary this week. I'm an Or HaChaim junkie this week for some reason. But he says Torah can be studied on 4 different levels: the Pshat, the Remez, the Drash, and the Sod. The Hebrew got a little mixed up there, but that's the correct order. And so the Pshat means the simple understanding. The Remez means a little spark of deeper understanding. The Drash is like the interpretation, the extrapolation, the sermon, if you will. And the Sod are the hidden gems, the hidden treasures within our Torah text that you need to really dig deep in order to find. These 4 methods between them account for what the sages call the 70 facets of the Torah. Each of these 70 facets is perceived as being a path one walks in the study of God's statutes. The lesson is that the approach to Torah study should be along a variety of paths. So as we're going into our interpretations of these laws and these mitzvot, we understand that there might be a variety of interpretations here. And perhaps that actually is the blessing of what it is to be a Jew, blessing of our tradition. So I just want to start with that. And I came across this really, what I think is this beautiful piece by Myra Seufer about the dance of the Reform Jew and the commandments. So would anyone like to just read this text for us?
Sure. Through the translation renders the word hinu is to follow. The usual meaning of the root ki is actually to walk. Jewish law is known as halakha, the walking path. As a Reformed Jew, walking in God's law is not for me. I'd rather dance with them. Lately, I've become a passionate dancer. I tap dance for fun, but ballroom dance is my unbridled joy. And on the dance floor, I've learned quite a bit about God and mitzvot. Dancing is a whole new way of being in the world. While I live pretty rationally, I dance best when I'm at least cerebral. I'm not too bad at learning Torah and Talmud, but learning the dance steps uses a whole different sort of memory. It's muscle memory, body memory, a kind of memory that goes deeper and far beyond the scope of my intellect. My greatest challenge in ballroom dancing has been learning to follow. I am used to being in control and trust my own abilities more easily than I trust my partners. It took me a long time to understand that following is a real blessing. Trusting someone else to lead when I can anticipate and know the steps to come has become an important part of my joy as I roll around the dance floor. Is God the supreme dance partner who invites me to join the dance of life and to follow a rhythm that engages my body and my spirit?
I just want us to take that in. What do we make of this metaphor of dancing? This quote of I walking God's laws isn't for me. I'd rather dance with them.
It's very joyous.
This addresses a question that I've had for years that I actually was wanted to discuss with you on a personal level, not in this forum. But how do we read the Torah if we go under the assumption that it was at least divinely inspired? What gives us the authority to pick and choose which of the laws we want to follow?
And that really is the crux of all of this, right? How do we make that decision? And you're right, it's a really, really, really good question.
Do we call that cafeteria Judaism, like some Catholics call cafeteria Catholicism? This is something I strive with constantly, frankly.
Yeah, does anyone here have any thoughts on that?
But why would you choose which ones you want to follow when I think we really should be following them all?
Well,
precisely.
Well, let's think through that though, right? Because our commandments include a lot of different things. Our commandments include the idea of stoning a man for having intimate relations with another man. Is that a mitzvah that we should be upholding? Our commandments include stoning someone. There's a lot of stoning it involves in my first examples for some reason, but someone for not respecting their parents. Is that something that we in fact want to uphold? For dressing, for women dressing in man's clothing or vice versa. That's not something that's allowed in the Torah. And yet for most of us, I believe all of us, those are not necessarily things that we would ever follow. So in essence, we are picking and choosing.
I think that Judaism, for me, through the years, encourages you to ask questions and to really, think things through and make it meaningful for yourself. And I think if you do that, you will stay with it. But asking questions and to me, not just following blindly is really important. And that's what I've always liked about Judaism. I like how the kids, when they start studying, they are encouraged to ask questions. And I think that's really important, not blind faith.
I have heard that the Torah, we could think of it as being living. It's a living, breathing Torah. And if you think of it that way, as anything alive, we change, and there are changes all the time.
Is that a
Doesn't,
rationalization?
doesn't free will enter into the formula of what we're talking about?
I don't think so.
If you have the choice of free will, then you can choose, you have a choice as to which laws you want to follow. Isn't that
Right.
part of free will?
Well, certainly we always had that choice, but the different idea here is whether it is better for us to make the choice to follow all the commandments, or whether it's better for us to make the decision where we follow some of them and don't follow others. And that's really complicated on many levels. And the question that you brought up, Steve, really underlines that, right? Like, why is it that we follow some and don't follow others? What does it mean that we make those decisions?
I think that the beauty of Reform Judaism is that, and going along with what Michael said about choices, is that if we follow the Torah but realize that we are in the times that we're living in, that we can accept people who dress differently than we do and make other choices. And whereas in the past, perhaps people, or as you say, homosexuals were stoned and so on, but now we accept them and welcome them into our society. Whereas perhaps in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, they would be shunned and from participating and being part of that community. I don't know, but I feel very comfortable with our Reform Judaism, and of course you as our teacher, Rabbi Cassi.
Orthodoxy is such a big movement that it's impossible to generalize about it because it's so incredibly broad. And there are many Orthodox Jews that are embraced regardless of their sexuality. And then in other communities, that's very much not the case. It's such a broad kind
I was
of
just
thing.
making a general comment about Reform Judaism and why it appeals to Sandy and me. Yeah.
So why don't I bring in just a little bit of these texts? We're not going to get through all of them, and that's totally okay, just to give us a little bit of an underpinning. So one of my teachers at HUC is Carol Balin. She is phenomenal. And she wrote this article called Mitzvah Mitzvot, where she gives a little bit of a history as to what's going on. So no longer could rabbis assume that the adherents to Judaism would abide by religious law because God said so. Jews instead sought rational and or provable explanations for practices both inside the synagogue and at home. This new mindset led to irrevocable changes in the meaning and performance of mitzvot. In 1885, the Reform movement in America codified its novel interpretation of mitzvot in the document that became known as the Pittsburgh Platform. In a forthright sleight of hand, the authors overturned the classical Jewish understanding of commandments by obligating Reform Jews only to those mitzvot that either A, bring about ethical behavior, or B, enhance the spirituality of human existence. And a statement whose reverberations were felt in liberal Jewish circles today, Reform rabbis asserted, we recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, and today accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the view and habits of modern civilization. In no uncertain terms, the early reformers relegated biblical law to a bygone age while elevating the moral conduct in the plane of religious duty. This audacious shift from obligatory observance of all mitzvot to a mundane to a mandate to carry out moral laws represents nothing less than a revolution in Jewish practice and theology. By denying the claim that halakha represents the revealed will of God, Reformed Jews were in effect asserting that divine revelation is progressive, akin to inspiration, and ultimately concerned with ethics. So that's certainly an answer to your question, Steve. And this is about the history, right? Reform Judaism has evolved since this point. But what do you make of this? Does this ring true for you?
Personally, no. I remember when the first group of rabbis were being ordained in America at the reception they had for them, where they went out of their way to serve foods that were non-kosher.
The Treifa banquet you're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's debate about whether people actually went out of their way or if it was a mistake that they just kind of went along with. There's a lot of different tellings of that story, and I honestly don't know which is correct. But that was why the conservative movement formed, was because progressive Jews said, we can't have an ordination where there's, pig or shrimp that's served. Like, that's absolutely not okay. We have to find some middle ground.
Right. This is a very big question that I don't even want to go into now because there's just not enough time.
Well,
frankly.
I mean, there isn't enough time. We definitely could make this a lot longer than we have time for today, but it's a great thing to start to kind of talk about.
No, she didn't say what did she do.
Any
Okay.
other comments based on that? Mike, did you want to say something?
No, I was just listening to, no, thank you.
He was just listening to me.
The problem is, I say, is once you start choosing which laws you're going to follow and which you're not, it's the proverbial slippery slope. Where do you stop? And the product that we've experienced now is that a large number of Jews today are so secular, they basically abandon all of the principles, and in a very short time, our people will basically cease to exist because they're not keeping up the standard. The standard has become so low that it doesn't exist anymore in some cases.
Right. So I think there's a few different things that go on here. One is that a lot of people misunderstand what it means to be a Reformed Jew. People say, oh, I'm a Reformed Jew. That means I don't need to do the commandments, right? And that's not actually what being a Reformed Jew means. What being a Reformed Jew means is that there are commandments, but we don't necessarily view the commandments as being straight from God. And so they're guidelines with deep meaning that we need to seep ourselves in, but not necessarily follow them the way that they were followed thousands of years ago. But the idea isn't to abandon all of it, but sometimes it's seen that way. If you look at the text right here, we see a quote from Rabbi Leon Morris. He's connected with Pardes. He runs Pardes, and he also is connected with the Hartman Institute. And he's a Reformed Jew who talked about Reform Judaism, but he offered some really kind of strong criticisms where he says a disproportionate emphasis on personal choice has dumbed down our movement. While sometimes marketed as informed choice, this rarely has meant more than learning a snippet of a classic text about a particular issue rather than the kind of immersion and wholesale commitment that ongoing learning requires.
Well, we're not related, but that's how I feel.
That was a roller coaster ride for me. The sentences that he wrote, I was so mad. I was so in agreement with him when he said that people, the notion of emphasizing personal choice has dumbed down our movement. I wanted to go, oh, right on. I 100% agree with you. Then he kind of elaborates and talks about it being informed choice. Okay, that softens it. All righty. And I kind of got upset with him. But for me, he saved himself when he says it's ongoing learning that's required. So in my mind's eye, it's not the following of the mitzvot, it's the study of them. And it is the Torah every single day, every year. And it's the study. And so I'm going to go on the record and say that I will never subscribe to the notion of stoning a child who disrespects his or her parents. I'm comfortable with that. And I'm comfortable with saying I will not follow that mitzvah, that commandment. I'm comfortable with that. By the same token, I expect of myself to study that and gain more understanding about that particular commandment as I evolve as a Reformed Jew, as a Jew. So that's how I can, but that was a roller coaster for me.
Is there a
It's worth the
possibility?
heart. Yeah.
Is there a possibility that the more you study it, which is what you said you would be willing to do, the more you go back to the
Right now.
original meaning?
Go and call right now.
Well, that certainly would be a part of the study, wouldn't it? All those,
Yeah.
remember the 4 levels of study that Rabbi Cassi read to us over there, the literal meaning of it, the interpretation of it, the putting it into practice. Yeah, that's why I've said to you all before, I cannot believe I'm reading the same book over and over again. I don't do that. I don't do that with movies. I don't do it with books. Why would I do it? I already read it. I don't feel that way at all about Torah study, ever.
Amen.
Yeah.
I like what Marla said, that studying it is what it really is important, rather than blindly following it, as some things don't apply today as they did, centuries ago. So I like that very much. And if I lead an ethical and moral life, which the Torah commands us to lead, but I don't follow every single thing, I consider myself just as much Jewish as anyone else, and a good Jew, So I don't think that you have to follow everything, and that otherwise it's going to disappear.
There are so many nuances here, right? And we all have to try to figure out what exactly makes sense to us and where we can find inspiration and meaning and really live our lives according to Jewish values. There's a couple of other texts here that I'm going to go over, even though it pains me to do so. Of course, Eugene Borowitz, who came up with this idea of covenantal Judaism, he wrote so much, and I only included a few sentences here, and yet I'm going to skip them over right now. And Mark Wachowski, who is the head of the Responsa committee. So what Responsa is like when people send in questions about things relating to Jewish life, and say like, what does Judaism say about getting the vaccine? What does Judaism say about this? He goes back to halakha, he goes back to Talmud, he goes back to the traditional Jewish text and tries to figure out exactly what Reform Judaism has to say about these things. And in this piece that I included, he talks about what that looks like. And there's so much here that is worthy of discussion. We just don't have time to do it right now. So I encourage you to look at that. But the piece that I do want to look at is this last piece by Yael Splansky. And that's because she takes this idea of commandedness and puts it into a different context that I think can add to our discussion. So she talks about, at the very beginning, Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf. He was a leading light for the movement and challenges us to consider the great contribution Reform Judaism can make to the Jewish world by ethicizing the ritual mitzvot and ritualizing the ethical mitzvot. What could this mean? When Reform Jews refrain from eating treif, they fulfill the ritual mitzvah of kashrut. When in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, many Reform Jews boycotted California table grapes and called them treif because the migrant field workers were being treated as slaves, they ethicized the ritual of keeping kosher. When Reform Jews turn our synagogues into homeless shelters, they fulfill the ethical mitzvot of feeding the hungry and welcoming the stranger. When the volunteers recite a prayer to start their preparations, when they wear kippot as they serve the warm meal to the hungry guests, they ritualize the ethical. When a circle of friends supports a woman through her battle with cancer, they fulfill the ethical mitzvah of Bechor Cholim, visiting the sick. But when she completes the regimen of chemotherapy and radiation, and her friends shower her with heartfelt prayers of hope for a healthy future and accompany her to the mikvah, which cleanses the poison from her body, they ritualize the ethical.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
So it's taking this idea of mitzvah and saying, how do we add a modern moral spin to it? How can we actually get to the heart of what this mitzvah is all about and make it real and meaningful right here and now in this particular position? And I think when we do that, what power there is in being a Reformed Jew, or to be in any movement as a Jew doing these things. So I just want to kind of open it up. Any thoughts or reflections based on all of this text?
That last reading was powerful. I liked it a lot. That makes sense to me. It makes me feel proud to live Jewishly. And makes me feel happy that I can make these connections to the Torah, oftentimes not even realizing it. I really like that.
A lot to think about today.
Yeah.
I know this could easily be a huge, 4-part thing on mitzvot and commandedness. This is just a small kind of snapshot into that. There's so much to discuss and to wrestle with.
Sometimes I'm hypercritical of others, and I feel that's one of my biggest downfalls. And I hear in a person's voice, well, because the Torah said so, or some people I hear say, the Bible told me so. And I think to myself, oh, Marla, you're being very narrow because you're accusing them of being very narrow. And, I work on that constantly. My takeaway for today is to be open and to make the connection between what the Torah says, what I can follow, and who I can become as I keep learning. So I feel better about myself, not so judgmental.
I think it's hard. We all make the choices that we make for ourselves for a reason. And we're passionate about those choices, or at least I hope we are, right?
Yeah.
But with that, it's hard to make those own personal choices while at the same time being able to uplift the very different choices that our friends and community members make. So now that I've left everyone speechless because I've shoved so much at you over the past hour, I'd love for us to end with words of blessing. Marla, I have no idea if this text relates to what we studied because we only looked at one verse. But
well, the text that's related is 3 verses later. So I don't know if we put a connection. The verse that it comes to is verse 6. So I think we were at verse 3.
Yes.
And the verse reads, I will grant peace in the land, and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts, and no sword shall cross your land. I guess that's the idea that if we obey God's laws, we'll have peace, we'll have prosperity, it'll be okay. So with that in mind, it's a blessing for all of us for acceptance. May you accept that you cannot always choose the circumstances of your life. May you feel a measure of peace in the face of life's terrors and dark moments. Never cease to celebrate the freedom to choose your own best path, to respond rather than react to situations you cannot change. Pain and loss will happen, but suffering can be lessened by the way you respond. Hold yourself gently in an embrace of compassionate acceptance each night as you lie down.
That's a beautiful, beautiful prayer right there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you all for taking part in this Torah study. I'm going to send this over to you, Jerry, and to you, Ezra, so that you have it. And I encourage you to look at it more.
Thank you.
Perhaps we can find a way to continue this conversation later in the future. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.